Giles, thank you for inviting us to Glendale Forest. Can you tell me a little bit about your role here in the Woodland Creation Challenge that England and Wales have now embraced?
Yeah, so I'm founder and trustee of an environmental charity called Carbon Community, and we're really set up to try and accelerate the science of carbon sequestration and really to answer one of the big questions, which is, what does it take to maximise carbon sequestration in tree and soil?
As you mentioned there, your role here is to really maximise the full potential of every tree that is planted. How are you going about doing that?
So we use a combination of different techniques. These are techniques that basically have been developed in the lab, but not yet proven at scale. And one of the things in the early days of setting up the charity was we started asking scientists really about, okay, so how do we maximize carbon sequestration? And what I thought was a simple question, it turned out to be very complicated. And we discovered that actually there's a problem in that stuff that's proven in the lab doesn't get scaled up. And running field trials is complicated, expensive, difficult, and as a result, things don't happen. So we are taking techniques which are proven in the lab, but have not yet been proven at scale.
Has this been done before, and if not, why not?
Well, I wondered that many times myself. It seems like an obvious question. Environmental science is about 30 years old, so it's not that old. It's still relatively new. And there are a couple of data sets in the UK, both of which are not that recent, basically looking at carbon sequestration. And on all of that, all our tree policy is built. So there is fundamentally a gap. The second reason why people haven't done it is that actually to do it on a scale is pretty expensive and complicated. Measuring trees, getting down on your hands and knees, and it's very people intensive.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the community and what it consists of and how you interact with it?
Yeah, as an organisation, we describe ourselves as being about trees and science and people. And the people part, the community element, is really the ability to get involved or get local people involved. And in particular, because this is a scientific study, we get a lot of students involved. Master's projects happen on site. This effectively becomes a facility for scientists and for the student community basically to work with.
Have a lot of scientific partners with you. Why so many scientific partners?
So we actually have sort of three different groups of partners, if you like. We have our forestry partner, which is Till Hill Forestry, who helped us find the site and then ultimately run many of the site operations, including planting the 100,000 trees that we planted last year. I didn't want to do those all myself. And we then also have local universities, such as Swansea and Bangor, and we work very closely with them, really around building what we do here into the curriculum, giving students field work experience and those sorts of things. And then we work with our core scientific team, which comprises the Crowther Lab at ETH Zurich, then Kew Gardens, Imperial College, and also University of Sheffield. And you might say, well, why do you need so many scientists involved? And that's really because we are layering these different techniques and we're doing this combinatorial trial. If we're just doing one thing, then we probably have one partner. But we assembled a group of a scientific panel, if you like, really to do that. And whilst volunteers may do the measurements of trees on the ground, our scientific partners, in particular at Kew and Imperial, are out here taking soil samples and doing analysis in the lab to then figure out what's happening below ground and above ground.
So Charles, carbon sequestration here isn't just about the removal of carbon from the atmosphere into the trees themselves, but also into the soils. Can you tell me a little bit about why that's important and also how you're going about doing that?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that most people don't realise is actually most of the carbon is stored below ground. You know, the tree that you see above ground, that's the minority. 78% is stored in the soil and the roots. So it's a big chunk. Today, you don't really get paid for that. You only get a tiny little bit of credit from the Woodland Carbon Code because it's too difficult to measure, and we don't know enough really about soil science. Soil science is still fairly early days, and carbon soil science is still very early days. So what we're trying to do here really is we're trying a combination of different things to really maximize carbon sequestration in both tree and soil. And also we're trying to figure out how to measure it and try to measure it in a cost-effective way that then allows farmers and foresters basically to get paid both upon what happens above ground and what happens below ground. So if we look at the land around us, this was sheep farming for many, many generations. And as a result, it was basically monoculture grass, which had been grazed very, very short. So it's not a great environment actually for natural regeneration of trees. I mean, we have a total of 72 test plots, and many of those are control plots too, where we see the natural regeneration. You don't see a lot of natural generation coming through. And there are different reasons for that. Partly, obviously, there's the competition from grassland, which you can see all around, but also the soil itself. And if I grab a little bit, this is sort of typical of the soil that we have here, into which we plant trees. You can see it's not exactly very rich in lots of biodiversity. And if you compare the biodiversity in a mature forest with a site like this, a mature forest in a cubic meter, you might have as many as 60,000 different types of beetles, bugs, bacteria, and fungi. And the fungi in particular, the mycorrhizal fungi, are very important for the trees to get established. If you think about our own guts, we need healthy gut bacteria, which helps our immune systems. It allows us to then absorb the nutrients that we eat and the vitamins, and allows us to then process them. Trees are exactly the same. Mycorrhizal fungi extend tree roots by as much as 100 times, and yet you find that in a site like this, without any help, it's going to take decades for that mycorrhizal fungi and that biodiversity below ground to build up. So one of the things that we do, one of the techniques that we're using, is we take soil like this. We'll see how different it is, right, from existing woodland. There you go. Right, so this is full of goodness. Obviously, it's also full of leaf mold and various other things as well. And in fact, if you want to see where trees regenerate, they almost always regenerate the edge of woodland, where you've got leaf mold and you don't have grass competition. And there you'll see many, many of these little shoots coming up. It's partly because the soil's that much richer. So this contains the critical mycorrhizal fungi. And one of the techniques we're using here, which works brilliantly near the lab, but hasn't been proven at scale, is as we put the tree in the planting hole, we then scatter this soil on top of the roots. And that is really to inoculate the tree with this mycorrhizal fungi and this rich soil. Okay? Very simple to do, particularly in a site like this where you've got bits of woodland around and about where you can then go and harvest this very easily.
I believe you're also looking at another approach to increase the amount of carbon capture in the soils.
In fact, we're using basalt. This is crushed basalt. You can have a little bit. This is basically a byproduct of mining. Basalt rock chips are used, this sort of size, are mined primarily for use in asphalt. We all drive on it every day, and we don't really realise that actually there's bits of basalt in there. And as part of producing rock chips of a certain size, you naturally produce this dust. This comes from a quarry about 20 miles up the road at Bilth Wells, where they have hundreds of thousands of tons of this basalt dust, which is just sitting around doing nothing. And what's amazing about this is, in fact, this field behind us here, we deployed 40 tons a hectare, at a rate of 40 tons a hectare about a year ago, basalt on this. And if you'd come here then, the fields were sort of grey and stripy with all this sort of stuff. And what happens is, as rainwater falls on this, it creates a chemical reaction and it breaks down. And as it breaks down, it does two things. It absorbs carbon dioxide from the air at a rate of 8 to 12 tons a hectare, which is significant, right? And then secondly, as it also breaks down, it creates calcium carbonate or limescale like you find in the bottom of your kettle. which increases the pH of the soil, reduces soil acidity. And this is slightly acid soil, so many of the trees like that. Farmers for many generations have put lime on their fields. So it's not anywhere near as strong as lime, but it obviously has the big benefit of drawing down significant amount of carbon dioxide at the same time. For forestry, this is potentially very significant because there is a carbon footprint associated with forestry today. Forestry operations, whether it's transporting the trees or growing the trees in the nursery or freezing them, or then the ground preparation that's involved. And what this potentially does is this is a game changer because it means that forestry, or the creation of forestation, can be completely carbon negative. And foresters and farmers in time will be able to get paid on this. Today, you can probably get paid on this as part of a carbon offset, and therefore that will more than cover for the cost of actually putting it down. The second big benefit of this is that it also, as it breaks down, releases trace minerals, a little bit like a vitamin shot for the trees. And there's some evidence then we'll get some increase in yield for the trees, in addition to the carbon sequestration that goes on. Well, in life, there's rarely one silver bullet that solves all ills, right? It tends to be a combination of things. And is one of the reasons that we end up with such a large-scale trial here. 72 test cells, 26 acres, 26,000 trees. I mean, it's on an enormous scale. It's probably the largest carbon sequestration trial anywhere. And that complexity is because we're trying lots of different combinations. So we have broadleaf and we have conifer, mixed broadleaf and conifer. So that's the first split. We have basalt and no basalt treatment with both of those. We then have soil inoculation with both of those. And then we have soil inoculation and basalt and either broadleaf or conifer. So we have 8 different combinations and control groups, all then replicated 8 times, which is why we have, such a large project.
But what sort of things are you measuring, and how are you measuring them?
Yeah, I mean, it really breaks down into sort of 3 core areas. There's a set of measurements which volunteers take. They come on site, use our tree app, scan a tree, measure its height, measure its diameter, check its health, do tree identification, and that's done by volunteers. And we have 6,400 odd individually catalogued trees, which is anyone who's done individual cataloguing trees knows is a lot. Then secondly, we really are looking at what's happening below ground, and both in terms of the water that the trees are drinking, using this instrument here in front of us, which is a lysimeter. And this allows us to basically take a sample without disturbing the soil of the water that the trees are absorbing. It's got a ceramic tip about 40 centimeters down. We put a vacuum pump on it and allows us to then draw a sample out. From that, we can see the basalt breaking down. That increases the soil acidity, so we can see the changes in pH as a result of that. We also take soil samples regularly, and we measure soil organic carbon. So we've got an organic carbon map of the area here before any planting was done. And then obviously, as we go through and the trees are then beginning to put carbon into the soil, we then measure that over time. And then finally, we also look at roots in particular, and populations, biodiversity in terms of mycorrhizal fungi. Because mycorrhizal fungi, it's not just about the numbers, it's also about the breadth in terms of the numbers of different types of mycorrhizal fungi that are there.
What sort of results are you getting and do you expect to get over the coming years?
So there are things that we know for sure because they've already been proven in the lab. So for example, we know 8 to 12 tons of CO2 absorbed from deploying crushed basalt at a rate of 40 tons a hectare. This is very well established in multiple studies. Nobody's really done it yet with forestry. So we're the first really to then go and do it properly, to understand what is the impact on forestry, what is the impact on different types of trees and those sorts of things. We can already see, for example, that we have some significant lift. Now, we have 1 growing season behind us, so significant, statistically significant, absolutely. We really need another growing season before we can totally with great confidence say, this is how this will work with this type of soil, etc. So our process will be in October of this year, we will then come back out with a whole bunch of volunteers again, measure a whole load more trees, more soil samples, etc. And all of that will then go into a scientific paper, which will then be published, and we'll then disseminate those results far and wide. Assuming always we've got the right level of statistical confidence. If not, we then have to go another season. But we'll try and do it this season if we can, based upon 2 full growing seasons, because there was a climate emergency on, and people want to know, should I be doing this or not?
All of this amazing, cutting edge, innovative work that you're doing, How do you think it's going to influence tree planting in England and Wales in the coming years?
And I think much tree planting is getting wrapped up in carbon sequestration. It's just inevitable. It's a very important source of finance for many people doing tree planting. It's also brought more people into tree planting as well because of the need to try and offset emissions. But I think the other aspects that are going to be important here, apart from the how much carbon can I sequester, is also the role of biodiversity above and below ground. I think it's widely agreed that we need to plant a wider diversity of trees. It's insurance against changes in the climate, but also we need to begin to think about the role of biodiversity more generally above and below ground. I think that before this goes truly mainstream, it needs to get built into the way that the government actually then pay out on carbon credits. We're making tree planting more complicated and more expensive in the techniques that we're using here today. But it's very clear that if there is lift in terms of the way the trees grow, if there is more carbon sequestered, if you get paid more because you're sequestering more carbon, then it becomes a complete no-brainer. There is some hassle to it, there's no doubt about it. For example, if you don't happen to have woodland on your site, then where do you go and get the soil inoculum from? There's some work to do to then make sure that you do that in a way that's sympathetic to the woodland you're taking it from as well.
So Charles, thanks so much for showing us around Glendale Forest today and the carbon community work that you're doing. It's been fantastic to see the cutting edge of tree planting and accelerating woodland creation and management within England and Wales, and we look forward to seeing more of your work in the coming years.
Thanks for coming.